I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Tony Weinstein to our event today. For those who don't know him, he is currently the co-director of the IU Summer Piano Academy and a faculty member of DePauw University, teaching so many things. He's teaching advanced keyboard skills, piano literature, piano pedagogy, secondary piano, and he's also accompanying. He also teaches piano and theory for the IU Young Pianist program. So with years of knowledge, we're so lucky to have him here today to pick his brain on how to effectively teach theory to young students, especially online. So let's welcome Dr. Tony Weinstein, and I'll let him take over now.
All right, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me. Um, I think I like doing this sort of misdirection type of thing, where when they ask me to how to teach theory, my response usually is that you shouldn't. Um, in the formal sense of what we tend to think of as theory, which immediately sends us off on a path to something that's complicated, abstract, dry, not particularly interesting unless your brain is built a certain way, and certainly not something that we associate with children. And that may be, let that be as it may. And we can't really undo all those stereotypes within the context of working with a young student that assumably you just met. Presumably you just met them, and this is, you're just starting to teach them piano, or maybe they're not a beginner anymore, but you're just getting to know them, and this question sort of comes up in your head. For me, the most important thing to realize is that, well, there are a couple of things to realize. First of all, theory is not something that is just a kind of a series of labels to put on objects. It's not an abstract body of knowledge. For me, it's something that's living and breathing, and it's something that I don't think of as a separate entity when I teach. It's just kind of part of what you do as a piano teacher. And for me, probably the greatest example when it comes to that actually is, if you've done any collegiate theory, especially graduate level theory, you will have come up against the name of Heinrich Schenker. You've seen Schenkerian theory, and it's like, even if you didn't know that that's what it was called, this is what you've been learning. If you've went to school in the U.S. and you did a theory class at any point in your life, you've been learning Schenkerian theory, and his influence is extremely important. But the thing about him was that he never thought that he was teaching theory. He thought he was teaching piano. He was always under the impression that he was teaching piano to his piano students, because that's what he was primarily, a pianist and a piano teacher mostly. And that's sort of the way I approach this as well. So it's something that is practical. It's something that immediately has applications to what you to play and how you play it. That's why there's no limit on how early you start. If you don't make it a separate unit, if you don't make it a separate kind of thing that exists on its own, that then we're going to have to deal with inventing bridges between the island where you teach music and the island where you teach piano, to where you teach music theory, and then try to bridge those gaps. Let's not have any gaps in the first place. I usually try to incorporate just that kind of thinking, that kind of hearing into what is generally regular music teaching practice and regular piano teaching practice. So, the one thing that I would say is well, maybe a couple of things. One idea is to realize that at least, at the very, very least, theory encompasses two very broadly kind of connected, but at the same time somewhat separate areas. I mean, we're talking about written theory, which means analysis, and we're talking about ear training, and those, of course, they go together, but they must, you have to understand where to separate one from the other, and especially when it comes to young children. What we need to focus on mostly is ear training. And the things that we end up calling theory later on in our lives, the written concepts, that's important as well, but that shows up in their lives much later as more of a summation of what they already know. We don't need to give them labels necessarily. Some kids, you'll see that they will be very, very much into it, and they'll like that and they'll understand that. But as a general population, I wouldn't necessarily espouse teaching any of that. That's why I'm usually not a big fan um, of theory supplements, workbooks, that kind of thing. Um, they can be useful in certain cases, but I definitely, well, certainly, well, let's just start this way. I don't use them ever. Um, because to me, what is more important is for the kids to develop the ears and to understand what these concepts are in relation to what they do as players, in relation to how they, especially not even just in terms of studying or memorizing music, but in terms of how they perceive music, in terms of how they hear music, in terms of how they listen. So that's an important distinction for me. So when we're talking about children, we're talking about ear training mostly. We can label things, but they need to be labels that mean something to the kids. They need to be expressive labels and such, and so that then immediately has a bearing in how they play. So that's one important thing. Um, Another thing to realize about theory, and again, just to dispel a myth or two, is what it is for me, and I think I'll if I brought this up to my colleagues who are theorists for a living, who that's what they do for a living, I think, or at least some of the ones that I've talked to, they don't disagree. And that what is theory is all it is pattern recognition. It's pattern recognition, and we must realize, and I realize this day in and day out because I teach a lot of secondary piano to people who are musicians but not pianists. We've got to realize that we're playing a very, very special kind of instrument. And one of the most difficult things about our instrument is how many note signs per square inch we have to deal with. This is no other musician has to deal with this whatsoever. So for us, pattern recognition is an absolute must because we have so many spots on the page. There's so many stars that in order to make constellations out of them, it's something that we need to teach ourselves and need to teach our students from day one. So it's not something that we should relegate to a separate class. It's not something we should relegate to, label building or it's basic pattern recognition. What we call those patterns, it depends. I mean, some kids really like, and this is one of the things that I like in teaching. I like it when, small children can impress adults at dinner parties and they can say something like, well, this is a parallel period that consists of two phrases. One is 2 plus 2, the other one's 4, and therefore the antecedent and the consequent also make a sentence. It's something that's cool if a child can take on that and they can understand that and they can immediately kind of play with that. But that's not important. The more important part is that they notice that this goes together and this goes together and this is how they coexist. And how we call those things, whether we call them question answer or we call them antecedent consequent, it depends on the child. You just have to kind of react. So I would stay away from terminology, formal terminology, unless the kid is specifically like inclined to do that. Now, from pattern recognition comes another important thing, and this is something that I think it bears repeating many times in many different contexts. As we are forming these minds, and then no matter how young they are, this is what our job is. I mean, as teachers, we're engineers of the soul. It's a very old expression that was used a lot during the Soviet times where I grew up, and where and when I grew up. But I mean, there is a real kind of importance to it. We have to understand that we're shaping their thinking. We're shaping the way they understand music. And for me, I would just think about theory as was one of it's sort of the philosophy of music. So it's the whys of music. The why are you doing this and why are you doing that? And as long as you can construct a good argument, then you can explain what you're doing. And a lot of that will be intuitive, of course. But even with the very, very young children, what you want to do is what I prefer to do is to nurture their intuition by developing their intellect. And so anytime they're doing something, and I have the opportunity to offer them a choice. What would you like to do this, or would you like to do this, or do you like pattern A or pattern B, or exhibit A or exhibit B as to how one should play a certain phrase? I always ask them why, And this is where you get into, again, you get into some of these theoretical questions, and this is where we get at sort of basic theoretical premises that do apply to even young children. So to move from that sort of very abstract way of thinking, the sort of the philosophical basis, to something that we can actually teach and we should be teaching to kids right away. We should definitely focus on what it means, what tonality means. We should definitely focus on tonal centers. That's something that even a 3-year-old can hear. And this is something we should definitely be fostering in the youngest of all children. So speaking of method books, so I mean, I use a variety of them depending on what kind of child that I have. One example that I'll share is from this Ukrainian method book that I grew up with. This is meant for really young children. I'm about to share my screen, so I'm going to pull up the file. And this is the first page of the first lesson. And it looks like so. You can see that. This is the first piece that they would play. And at this point, it's not really reading. This is where it's more like the teacher will show, the teacher will play. And the book itself, the prefatory text will explain that this is something that the kids should be picking out by ear. This is something that they should be singing along with. As you can see, for those of us who are paying attention, this is the middle finger approach. That's the storied Russian approach. You don't do the positions. Be that as it may, I don't want to get into that argument right now. But yes, this is definitely the side of the argument that I'm on. So you hear this tune, and right away, what we're doing is we're teaching stable notes within the key. And so, how do you teach tonal centers? Very, very simply. You play the tune for the child, and ask them whether that will work as the final note. And of course, most of them won't. Most of them will say no, or some of them will immediately realize that you're playing a game with them, and they will say, "Oh, of course, yes." And then so you have to be willing to go into the absurd with them. But you start with various notes in the various diatonic notes, or here or there, and then eventually work yourself into chromatics. And make them realize where one is. Whether you call it one or do or whatever other syllable, the point is to realize the tonal center and to realize the pull that it has. This is how you establish the tonal system. Or at least this is how you find the sun in that solar system. The next things that would come would be realizations of where the stable notes are, where their unstable notes are. Of course, this is clearly in C major, and we're going 5, 5, 3, 3, 5, 5, 3, and those are reasonably stable. And so some of the kids, if you ask them to sing the final note, they would say da 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 dee da da. That works for them, because that you're finishing on scale degree 3, and that's a reasonably stable note. And so immediately from the tonal center, you go on to build the idea that 3 and 5 are also reasonably stable because they're part of the tonic triad. Whether you call them 3 or 5, or you call that the tonic triad or the triad, no, it doesn't matter. As long as you realize, okay, these notes work. This is our sun, and these are the main planets or something. You can immediately invent analogies that go with that. And then with that, they should realize fairly quickly, within minutes, that da, 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 that note is unstable, and it must be resolved. And so what we're bringing ourselves to is this immediate recognition of the fact that we can teach tension versus release, and eventually, based on that, also that most expressive thing that we've got as people who play tonal music, at least, dissonance and consonance. We can teach that from the very first lesson that they have. Now, should we call them dissonance or consonance? No. You should invent things like, these notes go together or these notes don't. This one's stable, this one's not. Again, if they're into it and if they like, long words, then you go ahead and teach it to them. But if they're not into it, if they're scared by them, let's not even worry about that. Um, and immediately with that, if I were teaching this lesson, and I've done this with quite a few kids, in that first lesson, immediately also go from teaching them the idea of the tonal center as the one note, but also tonal harmony. So if you go to teach them that this, while it's a beautiful reharmonization, doesn't work like the home key, even though I'm playing the right note, because that would be the immediate next thing to do. So they immediately start developing an ear for colors, an ear for harmonic colors, and you can play either things that really obviously don't go together. I mean, like things that they're very dissonant or something. That's not going to work. But you realize, this is a chord that does actually work. Or especially that A flat major chord that I played, as the flat six. Of course it works. But you realize that it's not home, and that's something you need to teach them right away. And so developing that tonal sense is something that is absolutely instrumental and fundamental to any musician's living. And what explains all tonal music. And I just don't want to branch out into music that's before that or after that. But let's face it. I mean, the majority of what we do, the majority of what we teach, is music from the common practice period, which means that sense of tonality and everything that's in it is absolutely crucial to it. And this is something that we should not be waiting to teach to them, especially with these precocious kids that are driven and they practice a lot and their parents are overbearing, and they will be playing Beethoven First Concerto when they're 8. Or you know what I mean. I find it absolutely mind-boggling that a child can learn a piece like that, and I think it's a major problem on the pedagogical end. If the teacher has succeeded in teaching them that piece, and in maybe even having them parrot a monkey see, monkey do the phrasing, or even to a certain extent intuitively maybe, or just by copying a way of phrasing, a way of playing what we would call musically, without them having an actual emotional association with things like tension resolution, dissonance, consonance. I think that gets into the whys, and that gets into the something that needs to be fundamental and needs to be taught right away. So as you can see from the very first lesson, we do this. Another thing that I would find extremely important for ear training is that we must make them sing. Now, this is a real challenge for a teacher, because pitch matching is not a given. In fact, pitch matching is a serious issue, and it's just a matter of coordination. And the interesting thing is that there are many students with extremely fine ears, students with perfect pitch, who will have, and with excellent musical memory, but who will have trouble matching pitch. And this is it's a source of major difficulty psychologically, because first of all, for the teacher needs to realize that the child can be musically actually extremely gifted, in fact, like on genius level, and not be able to match pitch. Famous example, Leonard Bernstein. Every possible gift, but even as a accomplished, one of the greatest conductors, and I would say musicians with a capital M of the 20th century, matching pitch. Well, carrying a tune on pitch was always a problem for him. But apparently, as a child, yeah, couldn't match pitch. So I mean, it's something that, and I've seen this time and time again, because the vocal faculties is a separate kind of coordinative issue. And what we need to do is to get them breathing and to get them trying. And the thing about that is as long as they keep trying, they will find a way to eventually do it. As long as we don't cut them off. It's sort of like walking. Some kids will walk when they're 10 months old, and they will fall a few times and they'll just get it. And some kids will struggle with it for a few months. It doesn't mean that one of them can't all of a sudden turn out to be Well, I don't know. The example I'm thinking of is the Olympic champion skater Scott Hamilton, who could walk till he was 2. He did okay for himself. Um, and so singing becomes kind of a stigma, actually, if the kids don't feel very confident about it. And it's something that you should realize as a teacher, that pitch matching is not a given, and you should help them. The best way to mitigate, the best way to help them is to help them hear themselves better. There's a very old trick. As they sing, they need to cover one of their ears so they hear themselves better. Yeah. This is something that choral singers use, and something that even adult, like older singers, use when they can't figure out what pitch. And I do this. I know this as a voice coach. But for young ones, and you sing along with them, you play and sing along with them always. And so that's an important faculty. What that will bring about is a sense of very active inner hearing, audiation. So this thing we call audiation, which is hearing the note before you play it. And this means for us, of course, the note itself, finding the right key on the keyboard, of course, but it also means that the quality of sound. It also means that what kind of sound am I going to play with? And ultimately, if you're looking to build a musician, which means that it's somebody who is not playing technically only. What do I mean by technical learning? Think about machine learning, because that's all it's all the rage these days, right? Machine learning. What's machine learning all about? It's this machine is able to perform this task without understanding what goes into it. The machine does not care that there's all kinds of complicated conceptual backing behind what numbers are. It does not understand that what a miracle it was to discover the system of numbers for humanity. What a miracle it was to discover that 2 cows and 2 eyes have something in common. What is it? There are 2 of them. I mean, the invention of the number is just something absolutely fascinating. And a philosopher would understand that. Somebody who has mathematical training would go into that, and they would be able to compute things, but only based on the understanding of how things work. A machine doesn't do that. A machine just performs the task. I think it's extremely important for us, as we develop these young minds especially, that we very much are on the alert that they don't just perform the task, that they understand what is going on. We develop as much understanding as is possible. Understanding on every possible way: intellectual, intuitive understanding, emotional understanding of what they're doing. And so this to me means teaching theory, right? And so audiation is an extremely important faculty then. So the way one develops that is through singing. It's the most effective way. That's why we do solfege. That's why we sing along with our dictations. That's why we can clap and tap those rhythms in theory classes. Hopefully, since we were kids, and if not, then okay, then you do it when you're in conservatory. So yeah, those things are extremely important. Let's see. Another thing that I think that you can teach right away, and this is actually on this very, very first example, still is in the prefatory material that leads to this, says these kids should be picking out melodies by ear, and they should transpose things immediately as soon as they hear them. So getting them to start this same tune on various notes, you have to kind of rig the game a little bit. So I would have that in this case, with this piece, I would say, why don't you try starting that on a D? Because then they would be able to pick out the same pattern, and it would be the same white keys, and they won't have to face the idea of having to find the black key right away. They would figure that out reasonably quickly. Would move probably to F after that, because then again, then the beginning would work, and they would immediately realize reasonably quickly that doesn't work, and they would need to find that B flat, and let them do some trial and error before they lose their sense. But this would be something that, again, it can be done within the first couple of lessons. You have to realize how the child is reacting to you, of course. And if the child takes to it, great, do it right there and then. In some sense, I would rather we did that than move on to another tune. What does transposition do? It's very practical, of course, and it teaches them different keys, but it also actually uh, supports that other thing that I talked about earlier, this idea um, of tonal sense, because it teaches them that the center is not just that one note. It's not just always middle C. It could be anywhere. As long as we can set up a system, we can have we can have as many solar systems as we wish to have. And it immediately teaches them that, okay, all right, now this can be one, and this can be the stable notes, and these could be the unstable notes. And then you kind of start that whole game right away. And for our instrument, that's also extremely important because our instrument is built to be playable in all 24 keys. That's why it's there. And so for us to develop that sense in the child that these keys are interchangeable and to not be like a string player and stuck in D major and A major for most of their lives, not be like a wind player and be stuck in B flat and E flat. You know, that's the nature of their instrument. Ours is this one. Ours is the fact that we play out of tune, but we can play in any key. And we must know that. Right, and see, so to me, again, this is not something that should be tabled or should be done, you know, after they've played piano for 4 or 5 years, after they've gotten to a certain repertoire. And this is not something that should exist necessarily as a separate class, as a separate activity. It's just what you do. There's so many other things that go out of that come out of this. For me, the most important things are probably things that have to do with harmonic relationships within a key or outside of a key. So, for example, I have another example from another Russian method book that I would teach I use for older kids. It's one of my favorite things. This Polish song for teaching tonic and dominant without calling them that, but realizing the tension that exists between tonic and dominant. This is a great piece. And notice how slowly I'm playing this. Very much on purpose. Because you're also meant to teach legato and listening and singing along. So here we've established the key of D minor very, very clearly. And it's very, very important that the child realizes that these are the stable notes, but the B flat is not, and the G is not. And because of that, they arouse special attention. Especially the G and the F, that tension of 4 going into 3. Now again, do we need to attach labels to this for the children? No. But you can well, the stable unstable, that will work. You would make them understand why it is that we would lean on those notes, why we would lean on the B flat, why we would lean on the G, even though it's not on a downbeat. And then another thing that's important is to realize, okay, this is minor. Now, without necessarily saying, you know, minor is sad and major is happy, you can immediately make that much more complicated because even a 3-year-old will be on to you. But the bright and the dark, yes, that will work. And then try to establish the tension that exists between this and the tension of the dominant and the resolution of the tonic. And then therefore that leads to choices, performing choices. What I just did was probably the most obvious thing. You play the tense place with a little bit more loudness, and you play the resolution softer. And that's what we're taught to, you know, you highlight the tension and you highlight the resolution by playing it softer. And that's something that will be with you certainly in playing, I don't know, well, certainly classical period music. You must do that. And if you've got no ear for hiding your or not hiding, but tucking in your resolutions, if you're trying to play Mozart, then I'm sorry. I mean, that you have no idea how to play it, because that's one of the most important rhetorical devices for the classical period. And we don't have to wait to teach that. We can do that even before you get to the Clementi sonatines, because they're pretty complex by this point. You can do it right here Right there and then. This is number 33, as you can see. Most kids will get to this within, I don't know, a couple of months, maybe 3 months or so. Dominant tonic. And then realizing this is very, very cool, that we realize that this A as the dominant, it's a stable note within the key, but it's not a stable harmony. And you can just supplement the harmonies to them. And listen to how satisfying that resolution is. And what I would draw their attention to is what we just had in that second half of the piece was a parallel period. Would I call it that? No, absolutely not. But there's a question and answer. Also within this piece, there's also a great way of teaching echoes, of course, and that the text of the song has to do with it. But that's a different story. But see, this is to me where you find implications of theoretical concepts in immediate expressive performance, right there. And how you choose to call things, that's kind of on you as a teacher. But to not notice that and to not bring up that element of structure to the child is silly. Why not show that this is the 8-bar thing breaks down into 4 plus 4? It's easier for them to learn, for crying out loud. They'll realize that the first couple bars are the same. And go, you see how this is, these 2 bars are the same, and then we have a different outcome in the end. So if anything, it just even if to facilitate the learning process. Unfortunately, that part that I just said, facilitating the learning process, that's usually what most people will look for in theory. Usually what will happen is this. The child gets to a certain repertoire, and this is when they're in their teenage years, usually, and they're playing really complex stuff, and the teacher finally starts to notice that the child is learning slowly or having memory slips. Or when they're telling them to restart from measure such and such, or from that tune, or God forbid, exposition or recap, and the children will be just so weirded out, and the teacher will get mad and will say, how come you don't know any theory? You should take a theory class. I'm afraid that ship has sailed by that point. I mean, you can get on the ship, but it will take lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth if that's the point at which you start experiencing these things. Seeing that sort of structure, if they don't know the labels for this, they will learn the written theory concepts within minutes, even the ones that are not particularly right. If all they need is just a name to something they already know and conceptually understand quite well, that's a different story. But if they don't know what the concept is, then that's a problem. I think I've talked your ears off enough. I mean, I have many more points to make, but I'd love to open it up to questions.
Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. That's super helpful to reframe it like in this with the mindset that you don't have to introduce all these terms, but
Yes.
you can still show them. I think that's a really helpful reminder for me. I guess I was also curious about teaching things like chords and inversions, especially to younger students like under 8 or 9,
Sure.
because I have trouble explaining it in a way that makes sense to them. Or like, I was wondering if you have any visuals or metaphors that you use to show how like a first inversion chord is, like how this is actually just C major in a different position.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's a very old kind of game that I use. It's called the traffic light game. And so you just say, okay, so here's your traffic light. You've got your green, you've got your yellow, you've got your red. So what's at the top? Red. So we have to stop, right? Because that's what happens when the red is on top. What if we have those colors go in a different order? Now we've got yellow on top. Or no, we've got green on top. So that means go. And yellow on top, that means weight, or and so you relate this to the permutation of colors, and this immediately gets into voicing, because you're voicing the top, or maybe you may choose to voice the bottom if you'd like to. Plus, this idea of what's top versus bottom, it's right and left, so you can actually permute them any way you wish. That tends to be something I like to do.
That's great.
And that tends to work.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to try that today.
Yeah, I mean, and you can do that in multiple hands. Should you be well? Another thing you can tell them, just any sort of permutation game will work, because it's 1 2 3 2 3 1 3 1 2 all the, because you're playing with the order of things. You can always say that this is still a combination of C's, E's, and G's. And by the way, when I teach this, I would strongly suggest not starting with C major. I would start with things that, for example, a D major chord is much easier to deal with, because you have the visual of the F sharp for them to hold on to. Yeah, all and then this comes not from teaching 5-year-olds. This comes from teaching 19-year-olds who play the tuba, and who don't want to pass their piano proficiency, or they want to pass it, but they don't want to do anything to that extent. And so, yes.
That's a great tip.
Yeah, sure. Plus, actually, it fits their hands better in certain ways. Yeah, but speaking of that, actually, let me kind of extend that answer. To me, I think actually those things are important. What we call the fundamental touches. This is more like it's getting away out of, or fundamental forms, getting away from theory and more into sort of pedagogy and how I believe what I believe in. I do think that those things are important to teach. It depends on the child, but I think that yes, they need to know their scales, they need to know their arpeggios, they need to know their block chords and such. My experience usually is that with the very small-handed young children, chords is something I do a little later, and arpeggios is something I do a little bit later. But it is something that I think they should learn. And in the end, I make sure that all my kids learn all of them in every key. Yeah.
That's really great. I have a question for you.
Yes.
So, have you found any challenges like teaching online, like the singing and teaching students oral skills specifically? I feel like whenever I try to get my students to sing or do anything other than like playing or like doing like the theory workbooks that come with method books, they get super bored and they sort of just like stare at me and like, why are you making me do this?
Right. Right.
And yeah.
Yeah. So this is where okay, yes. I mean, that's a major challenge. It's a major challenge. Well, it's a major challenge in general. How do you keep their attention when they're on Zoom? And I have to say that I've been lucky, and somewhat it's just a matter of time, because they've been doing this for a year now, or close to it, and all of their classwork is or most of their classwork is this way as well, and so we've gotten some help from their classroom teachers and such. And if anything, we're in the driver's seat because we're one-on-one with them. We have a lot more attention. With the two main things, I would say one thing is to be extremely engaging and very energized when you do this sort of thing. You have to. What usually works for me is silliness. The sillier you are, the better. I mean, you have to like make yourself a little bit of a clown, but it helps them stay engaged, especially if they're young. Yeah, and you have to react to them. I mean, this has to be very much a reaction to what they're doing, and make them laugh, make them cringe. I think it's just it's a general kind of a teaching tool anyway. And it depends. I mean, like it depends. Like you have to give them the unexpected. Like for me, for example, especially nowadays, I'm getting into a certain age, and I will be introduced as Doctor, Herr Professor, Doctor such and such. So I'm this big scary thing, and so if all of a sudden I have a big red clown nose, then all of a sudden the kids go, "Oh, it's not what I expected," and that's great. And so what you need to know is realize what your expectations for you are in their mind, and defy them. So that's one thing. So it's just a basic psychological ploy. The other thing is you always lead by example. You don't just make them sing. You sing along with them. And if they're not able to sing right away, fine. If they're not able to sing by themselves, even not right away, even I mean, I've had some students that unfortunately I've never really solved that conundrum, and they all I can do is sing for them and hope that they're singing along with me. And I have some really advanced students that I've worked with for a long time. They just won't budge on that. But I know that I've seen the difference in their playing, whether they're singing internally or they're not. They're just so shy to use their voice. It's that's an exception, but it does happen, and I've had that several times. Where and the difference in playing is amazing. Whether they're actually hearing, whether they're actually singing along inside their heads, or they're not. And usually, leading by example is the way to do it. Yeah, and this is another reason why when you make this a separate exercise, it creates a difficulty because the context is immediately different. I mean, like they realize that the temperature is different, the heart rate is different, and so you can lose them right there and then. So it's much better to incorporate that into literally what they're playing, especially if it's something they like. And boy, what really works when it comes to, especially when it comes to teaching phrasing. And you can, meanwhile, while you can sneak in your modulating double periods, is you come up with stories. Come up with stories, and one of my favorite pieces to teach is the Andante from the Surprise Symphony. Wrong bass. Of course. Surprise! Yeah, that's not where the surprise comes in the symphony, but the excerpt is only 16 measures, so you have to fit it in somewhere. So that's where I usually fit in. If you find a way, if you make them come up with a story that goes with the phrasing, and I mean like really, and you have to come up with one yourself. That I love that piece because there's not a child that I've seen that does not immediately get like, whoa, what just happened when they hear that surprise. And I remember that when I was a kid, when my mom first played that for me. If hearing that at a concert for the first time. Nowadays, it's all in our phone, so you go on YouTube, it's all right there. And what you can do then is, without having to label them the phrases as, this is a half cadence, this is a cadence in the dominant, and then the third phrase is really not a phrase because you're just standing in the dominant, and the fourth phrase is finally a pack. Without having to name all those things, what you can say is, what you can do is have them come up with a story that goes with the questioning and the answering, and the tension and the release. And that way you've taught those things. And by the time you actually attach those labels, you're like, oh, remember that piece that you played? Oh, that's the antecedent. Oh, that's your half cadence. Rather than the other way around. Because if you do, we are going to be studying cadences today, you've lost a child. Unless there's especially nerdy. But I mean, that happens. That happens. In fact, the field, our population that we teach tends to be skewed in that direction. We're more likely to see those types of kids. But it shouldn't be the expectation. That they're going to be so nerdy that they would do that. Yeah. I hope that answers your question at least somewhat. But I mean, you have to really improvise.
That's
you have to develop you have to develop a rapport with them, and so yeah, that's really where it's important.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful.
Sure.
I find singing along, that's a very interesting thing. I would try and I would sing all the time, but most of my students would not do it. And even if they did do it, I would realize at least the first time or the first few times that they would not be able to match pitch. So what you're saying is absolutely true from my experience.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the progression that you use. So obviously it's easier to sing something that you've heard a lot, right?
Yeah.
But what if they can't even match the first pitch? Would you just play middle C and then try and get them to match that pitch? And if you do that, then how long do you spend before,
Well, I'll tell you what. So there are many things that go into that. a familiar tune is much easier to work with.
Mhm.
A tune that they can just sing, and then it becomes your job to match pitch to whatever they're singing, right? And so you realize, okay, see, this is a tune that they can sing. They're singing it in such and such key. Play along with them. Hopefully, it's a tune that with a. So you have to be okay. You have to be very strategic. The range has to be extremely limited. This is why Mary Had a Little Lamb is a wonderful thing to start with. But Mary Had a Little Lamb has a serious problem because it doesn't begin on one. So picking out Mary Had a Little Lamb for a child, like when you're assigning tunes to pick out, which I usually tend to do, you have to realize that Mary Had a Little Lamb, for all of its ease, starts on three. Not every child will figure that. In fact, most won't. Right? But that it's a wonderful thing in terms of the range of it. Another kind of little coral reef underneath is things like, for example, so you take a tune like Frère Jacques, which is a great tune, great, wonderful, 1 2 3 1 1 2 3 1. But the problem with that is it starts on a pickup beat, and so even that can create some problems, right? And you think the easiest things possible? No, we certainly don't start on the Star Spangled Banner because that's a horrible tune. That's why we have so many of those national anthem fails because they're just so rangy. So start something that's in very limited range, and something you need to find what their native singing range happens to be. It actually doesn't always turn out to be around middle C.
Mhm, mhm.
It more D major tends to work better. D E F
D.
sharp. Yes, D. Yeah, D is in door. Yeah, D major tends to work better, and this is where you have to kind of, and they can't play those notes right away. So if you're having real trouble with matching pitch, what I would try to do is look for a tune that they might know that is very limited range, or maybe even just the first two or three notes or so that moves slowly enough for them to be able to hear notes by themselves, each note by itself, and play along with them
Mhm.
to find them where they are rather than the other way around. So at least establish that coordination that way. Covering their ears, how much should you insist? If they can't match a pitch after you've played it 3 or 4 times, don't insist. Let it go. Let it go, because they're not going to get it. One game that I play with kids a lot, and this is when I teach theory as well, is very, very simple. Sing one. And when I play a basic progression and have them sing one, and then to branch out, to be able to figure out to sing one while I'm playing three on top is a major hurdle for even a very, very talented bunch. And God forbid I go from major to minor after that. So you have to be extremely kind of notice all of the steps that go into it and realize that there's a lot more complexity there than we mostly tend to see. And then you as a teacher, then trial and error. As far as I know, at least, because I don't know of any manuals that help you with this. I don't know of any books that help you. This is a major problem, by the way. Ear training, harmonization, even actually written theory concepts for kids of various ages. There are very few effective sources. In fact, none. I mean, like all the years that I've taught theory for at YP, which I don't do that anymore, but all the years that I've done that, I generated all my materials. When they get old enough, when they get smart enough, yes, then I go to like the Lates or the good old Aldwell and Schachter and teach them real voice leading and such. But before that, it's all on me. I have to find all that stuff on my own, create all that on my own, because most of the materials, well, all of the ones I've seen are just to be burned in one funeral pyre. At least you'll get some heat that way. At least you'll get warm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Wow, sounds like you should write a book.
I don't know about that, but because I know a lot of things about how not to do things. But one of the things, as you noticed, it's sort of like pedaling in Chopin. It's like yes, or sure, they're markings that he himself provided, and we know that they're different in the three different editions, and the three publishers that he published with. But you can see Chopin's pedaling and slurring sometimes. You want slurs, here are slurs, right? Why? Because it makes no sense to put down pedalings or slurrings, because that depends on the instrument you're playing. It depends on the acoustic situation. And so sometimes he would get annoyed and just go like that. And so this is a similar kind of thing, because since our population and our teaching situations are so incredibly varied, it's difficult to come up with a text that bears any resemblance to anything that would be usable. And one of the problems with the texts that are available there is that they're trying to address an extremely general audience. And in getting a very, very general audience, they end up not getting anybody. And so, because what it ends up being, when they try to make it specific, they specifically cater it to a test of some sort. ABRSM does a better job than others in some sense, because it's a unified actual system that's tried and true, whether you like it or not. By the way, the ABRSM books that teach kids how to read are a wonderful way of teaching harmony. The Right at Sight series is fantastic. I mean, level 3 sight reading from Right at Sight is a great way to teach diatonic theory with beginning chromatic chords. Fantastic. I mean, I've used that in theory class, because it's so incremental. But as far as having a body to draw on and having a text to draw on, it's a major issue.
Wow. Well, we're approaching the hour, and I think we have room for one more question. Anyone? If not, I have one.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about teaching students how to hear, basically oral skills, right? So
Yeah.
what about students who already have a really good ear, and they grew up singing in choir, so they have really good oral skills, they feel comfortable singing everything, but they're not quite great at recognizing patterns on paper. So how do you enhance pattern recognition on music?
Okay, well, there are a couple of things that go with that. One thing, you have to kind of divide these types of kids into two broad categories. One category is kids who have perfect pitch, which means that they can identify each pitch by itself really well. And I have to say that becomes a major hurdle, major hurdle, because a person with perfect pitch but without a sense of developed relative pitch is the prime example of somebody who's going to fall through the cracks, because they will go through their theory evaluations, they will write that dictation perfectly, they will write every B flat as an A sharp and not even give it a second thought, because what they're doing is they use their pitch memory. They're abusing their ears, absolutely, and 100%, no question about that. They're abusing their sense of perfect pitch without getting to the relative, without understanding what the tonality is, without understanding the interaction of the notes in the key, without understanding that a C in the key of C major is one thing, and a C in the key of A minor is something completely different, having very little to do with each other. A C in the key of F sharp major is like a completely different planet. And so the fact that you know the exact address doesn't matter to me one bit. Couldn't care less. So there's that personality, and in fact, I've usually had more trouble with those kind of kids, because what you need to do is be very respectful of the fact that they have this wonderful gift of pitch memory. It's great. You don't want to just put them down, but on the other hand, you need to let them know that, and it's part of it is that the horrible label of perfect. It's such a terrible word, but it's stuck, and it is what it is. It would be much better if we call it pitch memory, but we don't. And so it's you have to be respectful and you have to be polite, but on the other hand, you have to kind of make them understand that don't see everything yet. And so that's one side of the argument, the one side of the question. The other broad category are kids who, yeah, well, and I need to make this point because as soon as they realize tonality, then they will understanding the expressive capabilities of dissonance, consonance, and tension and relaxation, tension and release. And so, and before they do that, they can play all those notes, but without understanding any of that. And they can remember all those notes, sing them perfectly, without understanding what any of those things mean. The other broad category that you brought up are kids who sing in choir, who can sing and match pitch and very well. For them, usually the problem is not a horizontal one; it's a vertical one. When you've got a vertical issue, meaning that they can see each pitch by itself and they have a hard time like realizing how it all goes together. That's exactly when you start bringing out your labels. That's where labels will help. You realize, oh, this G and this B and this D, they go together. What chord does that make? And that's where what I would do then is, again, within their repertoire, probably it's even better within their sight reading. If you do sight reading as a separate thing, and I hope you have the time to do that. Don't always have the time to do that. But when we do, that's when we start baby steps. Because, of course, they get scared. And so, oh, you won't be able to identify all these chords. And especially if they have seen things like, I don't know, half diminished 6/5 or something like that. And they will get scared of that, and they will think that they're not very good at that or not very strong at that. What you then do is say, okay, we don't have to label everything, but let's at least find ones that we do know within what you're playing. Can you see that this chord makes a G major chord? Yeah? Don't you think that's better than not knowing anything? And then you help them find things that they do already know. And then you build from what they know to what they don't know. Start kind of adding them. There's going to be a learning curve there where they see after a while that what sounds like a bunch of gibberish to them, when you say like something like this, 2 half diminished 6/5 of 6, that might as well have been said in Hungarian. When you spell that out for them time and time again, after a while they will start catching on. Sort of becomes kind of like the Duolingo way of teaching languages, where you don't give them grammar really, but you kind of browbeat them into repeating it so many times that eventually it makes sense. Traditional theory methods actually apply to that group the most. Kids that already can, they have the oral skills, they understand, but for them pattern recognition is something that they need to face in terms of labeling. Yes, that's where, actually this is where those workbooks will help, as long as they're organized in the same manner.
Great. That was so helpful. Thank you. Any last questions before we wrap this up? No? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Weinstein. That was really informational. And please give Dr. Weinstein a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
If anyone has other questions, can we email you?
Absolutely.
Okay, can you drop your email in the chat if
Yes.
possible? Great. Well, thank you so much. Rachel, any last words?
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
My pleasure. My pleasure.